Well, good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for coming out to the Old State House and joining us for our third of 4 lectures in the Hartford History Lecture Series. We put this on every fall. It's organized by the Hartford Heritage Project at Capital Community College and with Fiona Vernal from the History Department at UConn. And with Mariana Garcia and the team here at the Democracy Center at the Old State House. And we really love having this venue. It's great having you come out in person, and it's great having quality streaming and recording. All of these are recorded, and you can see our past recordings of lectures from the website here at the Old State House and also from the Hartford Heritage Project website at CT State Capitol. I want to especially thank our sponsor. This entire series is being funded by Connecticut Humanities, and we're grateful for their support. Connecticut Humanities does fabulous support work throughout the state to amplify the humanities, particularly the public humanities, and supporting lecture series like this and exhibits and all kinds of things throughout the state. We are honored to be supported by them. And I have the honor of introducing our speaker tonight. I did what I normally do, and I didn't introduce myself. My name is Jeff Partridge, and I'm an English professor at Capital, and I am also the director of the Hartford Heritage Project. If you don't know what that is, talk to me about it or go check it out on our website. It's a great place-based education program that uses Hartford in our teaching. So tonight we're going to hear from Dr. Channon S. Miller. And Channon is a Hartford-based interdisciplinary Americanist and historian of Black women's interior and exterior lives. She received her undergraduate degree in American Studies from Trinity College in 2011 and completed her doctorate at Boston University, also in American Studies, in 2017. She excavates stories about Black motherhood and Black diaspora from geographies often marginalized. The city of Hartford and the lives of activism of its Black communities. Since the mid-20th century, mass migration of Black people there from the South as well as the Caribbean grounds and inspires her research. Her writings have appeared in many journals, and it's wonderful to see somebody who has done their undergraduate here in Hartford, grown up in Hartford, done undergraduate here at Trinity College, come back and be a professor right in this town and do research on it. So we are thrilled to hear from Channon tonight. So welcome.
Thank you, Jeff, for that introduction, and good evening, everyone. I also want to share gratitude with all of the organizers and the sponsors for this program this evening. This is a Black ecological return to Charter Oak Terrace, and it's a journey that I hope will be informative as we, in our present times, navigate various ecological catastrophes, especially water-based, throughout our country and throughout the world. And Charter Oak Terrace once had so much to say about our world's ecologies and climate, and we'll get into that a little bit today. So I'm glad to be on that journey with you. They should call it a dead river, said one man. A memorial wreath drifted on the water just beyond him. The man and the 49 others at his side wore black satin armbands. With hands grasped, their bodies swayed, and sorrowful cries, as well as prayers for the divine, joined the playful chatter of children. A handwritten sign on a decayed fence told why they gathered at Hartford, Connecticut's Flatbush Avenue Bridge on Mother's Day in 1969. It was a visual in memory of the young children of the Charter Oak Terrace Public Housing Project who were fatally suffocated by the southern branch of the city's Park River. It was an 8-foot wide stream of water that flowed beneath their feet and through their neighborhood. A year prior, in 1968, 2 missing boys, 7-year-old Robert Gallagher and his 9-year-old cousin, Frank Cerubi, were pulled from the river after a 48-hour manhunt. And they were last seen walking on top of iron pilings that lined the water. And for the children that were found before them, a scurry through the tall weeds of overlooked terrace, a field between their homes and the water, or a fall on the street's broken concrete led to a tumble down the steep river banks. And in other cases, for other children who lost their lives, the Park River's thin frozen surface would crack beneath them as they attempted to skate during the winters. Barbara Evans Henderson, mother of 7, led this assembly of mothers, fathers, children, teachers, civil rights leaders, and organizers at this vigil. She was chairperson of the ACP, which was the Association of Concerned Parents of Charter Oak. Hundreds of the low-income public housing projects families were inured to death, wrought by systemic harm. So they created the ACP in a community meeting on the evening of May 7th, 1968, some days after that double drowning. And they turned to one another. They turned to organizing as a means to compel the state to intervene. They picketed on the bridge. That was among their tactics. Their signs held messages that read, "We demand action now," "To hell with the City Hall." And this newly formed woman-driven ACP also dispatched delegates to government offices, and unannounced they knocked on the doors of the mayor, members of the city council, a director of public works, and the Hartford Housing Authority to issue their grievances and resolutions. The ACP called for walking guards to supervise their children, a handrail, brush clearing and overlooked terrace, fencing along the river bank. But at the fore of their arguments, at the fore of their protests, was a call for the lowering of the river's dangerously high flow. They demanded that the city either lessen its depth or cover the river. The occupation of the Flatbush Avenue Bridge and the ACP's meetings with Hartford's leadership would lead to corrective action, and in less than 24 hours, the city agreed to follow their proposed initiatives and lower that river. Yet a year later, in 1969, as they stand on that bridge, they found that nothing had changed. The fences weren't finished, there were bundled wires everywhere, overgrown grass and overlooked terrace, and the water level was not lower, but it was higher. They also wanted barricades to protect the children, not only from the river, but the construction that was taking place on the river's banks. Recall that the last to witness the 2 drowning victims alive was metal, asphalt, and cement. At the same time, the State Highway Department was in the process of completing a groundbreaking transit project, Interstate 84, which would connect the capital city to its growing suburbs. Construction began in 1959, and the highway was set to follow the path of the Park River. I-84's on-ramp and off-ramp at Flatbush Avenue faced the housing project, and what it did was it brought high and still waters to those parents' homes and to the homes of their children. With its ranks led and filled by mothers, both poor and black, the ACP walked through a river flooded by a politics of disgust, scholars have called it. In the late 60s and 70s, conservatives asserted that during the war on poverty, these women waged a war of their own against national security. They were devoid of a work ethic. They birthed children with abandon to exhaust federal funds. They were undeserving of citizenship. And critical to this condemnation was notions of race, class, and gender, and it left government aid-dependent people, families, and children in dead rivers. And as much as water would sustain their wombs, it would also drown them. Tonight follows the ACP struggles with an ecological crisis in their children's playgrounds, backyards, in schools. And in the breadth of traditional historical literature on Black women, especially poor Black women, it does shift the angle of vision to the ground and focuses on a marginalized segment of an already marginalized group. And it also extends a mapping of activism on and around urban inequality to include the city of Hartford, where African Americans have lived at the bottom of troubled waters for some time, but remain understudied in the broad literature and in the field that is history. So here, and in turn, I hope to unearth Henderson and her co-organizers from their obscurity and genealogies of Black civil rights protests in the US, but in Connecticut, and even in local people's environmental organizing. And it does reveal that in hearing their families' cries and those of the community, the ACP, they became organic activists, committed to the belief that they should not be kept waiting, as Barbara Henderson once said, because no big shots children got drowned. And so this work really argues that Charter Oak Terrace launched an early grassroots environmental justice movement in Hartford that far preceded its documented beginnings at the close of the 20th century. And the ACP put forth that the historic rustic beauty that was the Park River was not only a site of mourning because of man-made infrastructures and pollution and waste, but because of the children's bodies that it carried. By way of these mothers, the Park River became a site of inequality in spatial form. So the mothers, I suggest, produce critical knowledge, especially about Black ecology. J.T. Rowan and Justin Hosby, two writers who talk about this often, discuss the outside and the bottom as spaces that sustain and reproduce normative forms of biological and social existence, and that Black folks often live in the outside and in the bottom, and from their place at the margins of citizenship, they also witness catastrophe and become knowledgeable of and experts on catastrophe, sometimes far before other people do. And so the mothers of Charter Oak would be foretellers of changes in the state of water in Connecticut and Hartford, and would foretell climate change in many ways as well. And recovering their story and discussing this dead river allows us to do that. In March 1936, the Connecticut River, known locally as the Great River, would grapple with a catastrophic storm. So this flooding has quite a history, again, as early as the 1930s. And in 1938, after a hurricane, the Connecticut River would flood again, rising to 35 feet. And these floods really prompted Hartford to formalize and construct a flood control project with the U.S. Army and build flood walls and intone parts of the Park River and conduits 30 feet high and 19 feet wide. Despite this, flooding did continue, and there was even a great flood of 1955 after 2 consecutive hurricanes hit the East Coast. Connecticut received most of the impact, and the river rose to 30.6 feet. Hundreds were killed. Property damage totaled $200 million. And one of the regions affected by that great flood in 1955 was Charter Oak Terrace, through which the Park River's South Branch flowed. And by the close of the year, the state legislature established a Greater Hartford Flood Commission. Some years before that great flood, Barbara Henderson moved to Hartford in 1952 from her hometown of Thomasville, Georgia. And she, at the time, actually was a freshman at Spelman College in Atlanta, and she wanted to pursue employment over the summer so that she could save enough money for the upcoming semester. And she was also recently married, and her husband too was in need of work. And they were among the over 6 million African Americans who, from 1890 to 1970, steadily and sustained a movement from the rural South to urban landscapes of the North, West, and Midwest. And that, of course, included Hartford. Millions would travel for opportunity, especially opportunities to work outside of agriculture and gain and earn a reasonable income. Compared to Thomasville, Georgia, the economy in the Northeast was diverse, and there were also different ways to earn money, Henderson found. And they imagined that, although seemingly marginal, they would fare better with an additional $3 to $5 a week. Her husband gained employment at a meatpacking company, and by the fall, they decided to stay in Hartford for good. The Hendersons' motivations and those of other Black migrants in this movement were not solely economic. They were also thinking about violence. Jim Crow was a period marked by anti-Black white supremacist violence, and death was imminent, and it was customary. Moving northward allowed them to, at least they imagined, to escape the color line. However, while 18-year-old Barbara Henderson expected to find the grass greener in this new region in Hartford, she didn't find such green grass. The grass she found was Jim Crow North. And historians describe Jim Crow North as a form of racial discrimination and segregation that operated much differently from the South, but operated nonetheless. It was upheld by criminal, civil courts, police departments, and public policies. Strange fruit might not have hung from trees, and there were no colored signs posted in the vicinity, but it was clear that Mrs. Henderson and her family had a place, and that place was on the margins. They especially noticed this when they tried to find housing. Work was hard to come by, but so was a home that was sizable for her large and growing family. And time again, she would come to learn that her options were few, and those of other low-income Black citizens in Hartford were few as well. When the country enters the World War and there's a call for defensive workers, World War I and World War II, the Black population in Hartford grows. And so did, of course, challenges when it comes to finding and locating housing. They grappled with segregation largely in the North End, in an area that was known as the Bottom. So there was congestion, dilapidated homes, and illness was rampant. And as the numbers grew, the bad situation only grew worse. And as every Black family moved in search of home, they really found some difficulty. Now, there were public housing units available. The Hartford Housing Authority was established during that New Deal era, and they did establish here in Hartford various public housing projects, and this included the Charter Oak Terrace housing project, which they built in 1941, and it ultimately would become the largest defense housing project, not only in Connecticut, but also in New England. It cost $4.5 million to build, 137 acres. It had 1,000 units, 236 buildings made of brick and cinder block and wood frames, and it also had 4 sections, an A, B, C side, as well as a D side too, and gradually an E side was temporarily developed too to accommodate the many families flowing in from elsewhere. However, Charter Oak Terrace was not open and available to Black families, and that was the case across the country with most defense housing. It was largely relegated to white families working in defense industries, whether that be Whitney Aerospace, Pratt & Whitney Aerospace Company, or Samuel Colt's manufacturing company. Those families were able to live in this new and expansive Charter Oak Terrace, but that wasn't the case for Black families. And in fact, there was only one public housing project developed for Black families in mind, and it was called Bellevue Square. But it was quite small, also located in the bottom. It had 500 units, and that left the vast majority of Black families in search of home, in search of an affordable home. So many lived in boarding houses, stairwells, and back alleys. But it took civil rights organizations like the NAACP to really push the lines of segregation and allow these projects to open up to Black families. And they did agree to do so on a limited basis. They passed in 1951 a controlled integration policy, and that made public housing units, just a few at a time, available to Black residents. But many, hundreds, over 500 were on the waiting list, so this change was very slow. But as the need for public housing among white residents decreased, different opportunities, such as the Servicemen's Readjustment Act of 1944, really allowed white veterans in particular to purchase homes with low interest mortgages, and we see that they begin to move with time into surrounding suburbs like West Hartford, Enfield, and Windsor, and there was a high turnover of white residents, and this opened the door for more Black families to increasingly move in. And then by 1965, controlled integration does come to a close, and Charter Oak Terrace becomes a low-income, primarily a low-income, low-rent housing project, and increasingly, especially by the 1960s, the majority of the folks who live there are African American, and we also have the Puerto Rican population growing there too. But the houses and facilities that those earlier families experienced were quite different by this point. They suffered a great deal of dilapidation. A lot of the residents complained about bursting pipes and electricity issues. And what historians have told us is that the condition of public projects rapidly declines across the country. Funding, the federal government, while they had required a lot of these projects to go to families in need, they also dedicated less funds, withdrew less funds that could be allocated to public housing to ensure that it remained safe and sustainable. The river and the flooding of the river proved to be another dilemma for these Charter Oak Terrace residents, because when Charter Oak Terrace was built, it was built on farmland that hadn't really been occupied but was low-lying and had grappled a great deal in the past with serious flooding, especially those early great floods tremendously impacted that area. But even though it was flood prone, there really was no other available land to build Charter Oak. And so they decided to take and unfold and build there. But for folks like Barbara Henderson and their families, this would prove to be challenging as waters would continue to rise and flooding conditions would increase. But these moments in time, the flooding of the Park River and the increased dilapidation of the place that they called home, would politicize Black mothers. It would compel them to work with and interject in their conditions and call for change, especially on the part of the agencies that were set to or meant to protect them, such as the Hartford Housing Authority, the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development, and more. They sought to challenge what they believed to be was intersectional oppression that was made possible by their race, gender, and class, and how it compromised their children's lives. I had a chance to interview one of Barbara Henderson's children, her daughter, who's actually named after her, who might be joining us live today, and we talked about the politicization of her mother, and she mentioned that my mom had been a homebody as far as she could remember, and she went to the grocery store, or she went to see my aunts, Mrs. Barbara Henderson Davis said, or she stayed home. But that was until those two boys died in that river, and when that happened, that brought about a change in my mom. The terror that gripped Henderson in Thomasville, Virginia, returned with each body the river or the city recovered from the river. She believed that Charter Oak Terrace's economic depression and residential containment was not accidental, and neither were the drownings. Barbara Jr. and other neighborhood children's vulnerability to death and dying was an institutional problem, and Henderson refused to lose a child or watch grief blanket another family. Her consciousness was collectively shared and communally nurtured, and other mothers felt the same. They began gathering in Henderson's living room after those double drownings in April 1968. Barbara Jr. recalls that parents more and more would come out, and they discussed their discontentment as well as deliberated resolutions. They also identified the local officials and state officials who were by law accountable to their community's needs and decided how to open up lines of communication. While these meetings primarily were comprised of Black mothers, the neighborhood's white mothers also joined them, as there was still, especially early on in Charter Oak days, a group of poor white folks who remained there and lived there and also grappled with these drownings as well. And within days of the children's deaths, they planned a community-wide meeting and they issued notices to city and state officials, and 300 people crowded into Charter Oak's Community Center in May of 1968. And not only were there families of Charter Oak Terrace there, but the mothers invited the city council, the director of the flood commission, the mayor, and more. And they invited these officials so that they could hear and respond to their anguished pleas. The mothers insisted that the water must be either covered, fenced, guarded, or protected somehow. One of the victims' mothers proclaimed that, quote, "I vow to my dead baby that if I have to walk the leather off my shoes, I'll see to it that the river is covered." The officials disputed the probability of covering or lowering the river, and they shared how it would be unfeasible for the city just due to how much it would cost. It could cost up to $10.5 million. And one councilman suggested that fencing would not be possible because of the construction of the highway I-84. Barbara Henderson and her co-organizers believed that impelling the city to action would require that they continue to organize, gather together, and increase their numbers. So they would meet again at the Warburton Community Congregational Church, which is right on the corner of Flatbush, and was also a community founded by Charter Oak Terrace's mothers. And they would gather there to officially create the ACP and elect a leadership and more, and really clarify their strategy. And a part of their plans was direct action. And so this included going right downtown to the City Hall and the state official building to make their demands known to administrators who oversaw their building maintenance and the operation of Hartford's public works. And they decided to picket on the bridge too. And if their demands fell on deaf ears, they would do a sit down, as they called it, or a lie-in right on Flatbush Avenue. As early as 7 a.m. on May 8, 1968, a day after protesting on the bridge, a number of them would go downtown to visit the city manager and again make formal requests about lowering the river. And this delegation's meeting with that city manager was productive, and new fencing would be up in a few days. They also assigned a traffic engineer to conduct some research. They would also work closely with the city council to come up with a resolution as well. And they successfully were able to come to an agreement in collaboration too with the Flood Commission. And it was decided that the water would be lowered to 6 inches. In exposed sections between conduits, they would dig a channel. They would also provide a fence along the river to protect children from entering. And the council also voted to ensure that the Flood Commission provided funds, $300,000, towards the dredging out of the river. And within months, this money was assured and the work had begun. Governor John Dempsey also was in full agreement with this project and the guaranteeing of the funding towards the lowering of Park River and some of the other work that would take place. In order to complete the lowering of the river, the Flood Commission did have to work in close contact with the State Highway project. With the development of I-84, it meant that those folks were in close contact often with the Park River, and they were actually assigned the State Highway Department as the key agency that would really oversee the dredging of the river and the creation of conduits, since they were quite experienced in that already. However, people did have some concerns about this dual operation, especially those who lived in the suburbs and thought that maybe a focus on lowering the river would slow down the building of I-84 and would interrupt this, again, ability to get to the city and out and back and forth, but the work would continue. There were other issues that the mothers would encounter, and that was ineffective work on the part of the State Highway Department. Even the Flood Commission, according to the Hartford Current, would find that the work was quite shoddy, that there was a part of the Park River project that had collapsed. There was also a discovery that there were dams being used. And so the dams that the Highway Department used in the process of building I-84 actually made the water levels rise. And the mothers noticed this as well. So even though a year had passed, and they had started to really make progress with these resolutions, things seemed to stall. And the Highway Department's dams and their slow work around lowering the river definitely contributed to more of a risk for the children, the ACP determined. Several months had passed, and they also saw that contractors weren't really working on building a bridge. Again, they saw more emphasis on I-84 and less on the resolutions that they had passed. And in their visits to the mothers, members of the city council did promise that they would try to work on this and see this through. One of the councilmen would say that it seems that sometimes the city forgets people live here, that people live here in Charter Oak. And a supporter of the ACP, and a name that might be familiar to people in the room who study Connecticut history and a history of activism, Ned Call, would also find that Hartford, he says, is like a cemetery with streetlights when you want to get something done. Charter Oak's youth sinking to the riverbed did not seem to be a crisis, but rather a matter of fate. That Mother's Day vigil in 1969 was a response to the limited progress. Mrs. Henderson is quoted saying in the Hartford Current that we are going to fight with the Flood Commission to get this done. We were nice for a whole year, but the water's no lower. Thank goodness nobody else has drowned. We went through legal channels before, but now we're going to demonstrate. We'll demonstrate anywhere, the highway, department, city hall, anywhere. She also says that they holler about burning and they holler about rioting, but this is what causes riots. I look like a fool because I said to wait on the establishment. No more. It's time for action. It's time for action. So in this quote, what I find really compelling is she's responding to, as much as she's a part of, the Black civil rights movement and even the radicalization of the Black civil rights movement. She's also saying that this is what has caused the rise in militarism with Black movements, and that's the irresponsiveness of the city and of the state to respond to more of what she would call the legal channels of action. They would go back on the bridge, hold the vigil, but also insist on occupying that bridge for several days in 1969, and many others would join them. They actually enlisted the support of teachers at Mary Hook Elementary, teachers who taught young children affected by this flooding river. They work with multiracial nonprofit organizations who joined them on the bridge as well, and they would even call on the local chapter of the Black Panther Party who had just begun, actually, just a few days before the vigil. There was such a really close connection there between the flooding, the drownings, and the development of the Black Panther Party. But they were very new and quite young, and many young people in Charter Oak Terrace were involved in that party. But they also joined, and it was among their first protests to fight for the lowering of this river. But a really critical action that the mothers would take was actually deciding to go to the governor's mansion. And when I talk about how these mothers traveled to downtown or the city hall or to council meetings, this was no easy task. A lot of these women did not have cars. And at this time, the city bus didn't quite go to Charter Oak Terrace frequently. So when you're without a car, you're really having to lean on community or people willing to help to get around, and that includes getting all the way to the West End. They piled in a car, drove to the West End in May of 1969, some days after that vigil, and knocked on the governor's door in hopes that he would answer and allow them to proceed with the lowering of the river. No one answered, but they did leave green sheets of paper at his door, and they outlined the efforts they had made thus far to get the river lowered or covered. And the next day, the governor actually would come out and see the river and see the conditions, and again, determine those next steps. He actually would call on the State Highway Department to lower the river's level to 1.5 feet. And this would also include, he asked them to remove the dams. And that would help, as the dams at that point had caused the river to rise to about 8 to 10 feet. So Governor Dempsey joining them out there, walking them through, or them walking him through their conditions, is what really would compel action in the ultimate lowering of the river after a year of waiting. And these are just excerpts and images from the Hartford Current, which display some of the actions that I've described here, the protests, but also Governor Dempsey's visit. And you see beyond him members of the ACP showing him and walking him around Charter Oak, and especially having him look quite closely at the river and how much it had risen in the last year. Prior to the ACP's emergence, much of the region's discussions around the environment and more, and even ecological catastrophe, focused on aquatic wildlife and human waste. And there's a way in which the ACP interjected an assessment of the river that named the river as a civil rights issue. And there was something else that the ACP, through their actions and public discourse, was able to accomplish, and that was also creating an environmental justice framework. Before environmental justice was even coined, that would come much later. And in Hartford, the Hartford Environmental Justice Network wouldn't be founded till 1997. But here in the 60s, we already have a group of people, a group of mothers of Charter Oak asserting that environmental issues are also issues of racial justice. So before organizations even begin to weave these two areas together, women of Charter Oak are doing that for the sake of their children. What I find also important is the lessons, the ecological lessons that the women of Charter Oak Terrace offered. They found themselves at the helm of community challenges wrought by environmental racism and more. And their tellings and protests also foretold the coming of climate change. They were at a site of ongoing injury, of harm, of premature death. And in that space, in that outside and bottom space, they were able to really confront, witness, and experience raw spatial inequality, as well as respond to it. But the spatialization of racial, economic, and gendered hierarchies in Hartford ensured that the bridge could not withstand the rising Park River, and Henderson and the ACP experienced a physical world apart from those shielded from floods, those who walked on the bridges without a fear of falling through. And it's from their place of displacement and isolation that left them vulnerable to a water-based ecological catastrophe. But their protests also warned us of changes in the environment, an atmosphere that was warmed by greenhouse gas emissions, carbon dioxide, water vapor, and more, were all signs of extreme storm events only increasing. And they were at the front lines of that and were able to, again, foretell that something in Connecticut's bodies of waters was changing. And this was largely due to changes in climate. With their laying bare some of the issues that we would later see even with events like Hurricane Katrina, where we saw the breaching of those levees, these mothers were able to notice that in New England and in Charter Oak Terrace, that winter rainfall and snowmelt runoff escalated, and it functioned to lengthen and intensify high flow seasons of the area's waters. The flooding of the Little River was due not only to the industrializing of Hartford's waste and runoff and ineffective sewer management, but they also happened to be resisting at a time where scholars have noted that the state began to experience changes in its temperatures and in the frequency of heavy rain events too. So the mothers of Charter Oak Terrace found that their marginality exposed them to other harms, again unfelt by families on dry land. And from where they stood on this unlit burial ground, they beheld the deleterious effects of land misuse. That includes the construction of that I-84, but also so much more environmentally. Climate systems, atmospheric changes as well, were made visible when they went out on those Flatbush Avenue Bridge picket lines. The Park River's overflow was a new normal they would share, or at least their activism would tell us. Henderson would mobilize for her community until she no longer could. She died in 1974 at the young age of 39 from an illness. She lived to receive an award from the city of Hartford, and she would live to see the unveiling of that commemorative plaque that we now see on Flatbush Avenue, and she was able to witness the renaming of the Flatbush Avenue Bridge as the Barbara Henderson Bridge. And as the dedication cemented Henderson and the ACP on Hartford's geography, what this journey today hopes to do is also place her in the presence of our public memory of Hartford and of this space. Literature and archived headlines and documentaries tend to tell of a Charter Oak Terrace that was occupied by people devoid of a capacity and will to imagine a new reality or a new world beyond crumbling homes and destitution or windowless cement block liquor stores. While they traverse concrete playgrounds, a grassy meadow, and more, they are emerging in a lot of these pieces on Charter Oak Terrace as dangers to themselves and to the natural world. And what this journey tonight does is shows through Barbara Henderson, the ACP, that they weren't dangers at all to the natural world, but also, but helps, but guides, but foretellers of conditions and events that would allow us to save the natural world. This study humanizes the history of Charter Oak Terrace and the people who live there in our public memory. And I respond to the Black Mother-led ACP's invocation to city officials to come out here to the community. That's what they asked in those Hartford Current newspapers and when they talk with the City Hall and more, and to the governor, Governor Dempsey. In order to understand Charter Oak, you have to come out here and see how we're living and see what we're experiencing. Revising a memory defined by the dehumanizing ideologies that threw the people of Charter Oak Terrace into the shadowed edge of Hartford, this conversation hears and accounts for a river that was swelled by oppression, racism, sexism, and classism, and it enacts a memory of a legacy of welfare-dependent public housing tenants that built bridges where none existed before. The women of Charter Oak Terrace refused to wade in the dangerous waters alone, and they demanded that they were citizens worthy of government intervention. Their resistance did not again harm the land or harm the natural world, in contrary to what is said about Charter Oak Terrace residents. But they were again guides that foretold of critical changes. They were ecologically instructive for us, even in our present. Barbara Henderson, Dorothy Pearl, Patricia Alexander, Martha Taylor, and many other members of the ACP were ecologically constructive, prolific. And their finding that the Park River was a river to drown in presented an environment on the cusp of a catastrophic natural water system and global climate change. To use the words of Barbara Jr., that whole movement of the concerned parents, there was a lot of changes that happened for the betterment of us, for the betterment of our community. I'll conclude here, but thank you for listening.
All right, so we're going to open it up to some Q&A. So if you have a question, just raise your hand and I will bring the microphone to you.
Good evening, everyone. My daughter, Dr. Miller.
And
I'm her live muse.
And this is
That's
her mom.
my mom. I am,
Or Martha Taylor.
I am one of the products of Charter Oak Terrace. In terms of when I listen to Dr. Miller talk about the history of Charter Oak, there are some things that you can confirm and validate. And there's a gentleman that I grew up with in Charter Oak that's sitting here as well. But I wanted to share from a perspective of someone who grew up there that yes, the river was dangerous, but when you're a child, you don't know about danger. So I remember there used to be these 10 canoes that the guys would use because they played down there, unbeknownst to their parents. But because we feel we're invincible, oh, nothing's gonna happen, we can go down there. Well, I tried it, the girls tried to follow the young men and do the same thing. I was one of the unfortunate ones who fell in the river. So it was sort of scary, it was really scary, but I clawed resilience. I clawed my way to that bank. I said, dear Lord, I'm not ready to go yet. At least that's what I thought I said as a child. But I wanted just to share that Charter Oak Terrace in itself went through phases. And as Dr. Miller mentioned, as white families were leaving Charter Oak, as we call it nowadays, white flight, and other families came in, it was a time of real big diversity, because I had my first experience with a white neighbor who invited me to dinner, and she said, we're having tuna casserole, and I'm like, what's tuna casserole? So, you got exposed to those different things when the diversity was there and clear. So, but Charter Oak was one of the communities that we all talk about where we grew up, where you could leave your door open, where you could build a tent outside and crawl in there and spend the night with friends outside in the tent. So it had grass, and the management at the time had given families responsibilities. So you play baseball in one of the quads, you break a window, oh, it's going on your family's rent. Of course, when the parents got that bill, they're like, what am I paying for? Mom, Dad, I forgot to tell you, I broke somebody's window. So there were some wonderful, wonderful things, and the river was dangerous. When I was a kid, we lost a classmate. His name was Robert Taylor. But again, when you're children, you don't realize that. But the other ecological problems is when you have so many families in such a small area, the density of it, you have other ecological situations where there's not enough play space. There's not enough places to stretch and grow. But one of the things my mom always indicated, for some reason they were very resilient. Miss Henderson, Mommy, they were all so resilient because there was a way out. And that way out was through education. And that was reinforced and reinforced and reinforced. Now, at that time, you know, you had children. If you had an only child in Charter Oak, it was like strange. We were like, because 6 or more was a normal. So you know, you always had that village sort of. We still had the neighbors that, why are you over here in this section? Does your mother know you're in this section? We still had those normalities. And that is what, you know, we learned. So I just wanted to share that side of Charter Oak with the folks that are here hearing Dr. Miller talk, because she always tells me, Mom, I need you to record. And I say, Channon, I'm not going to record. I don't feel like it. And she'll say, well, this is history. And I'll say, okay, we'll get to it. But I just wanted to talk about that part of Charter Oak, because out of Martha Taylor's commitment, her activism, and her 6 children, she's lost 2 of us. But out of that community came principals and doctors, professors, as you see, police officers, lawyers. So we did listen. And we did want more. Not because we did. Charter Oak did 2 things. It made you strong, or it made you vulnerable. And those of us that were strong, we still reach back for those that were vulnerable. So we still listen to the activism. We were encouraged to participate because the lady that you see on the screen there, and you folks may know or be familiar with it, the Charter Oak health centers that you see in the different neighborhoods, she was on the board with doctors because it wasn't in Charter Oak at the time, but they again, another fight, because that stuff is instilled in you. So even with my mom, that gene is strong. We still do the activism with the education, PTA boards, the Zezel House that you see on Homestead Avenue. I work with the late Paul Ritter, the late Don Steinley, to see that come to fruition. So those are things that came out of it. But there was also, like you said, there's the dark side, but there's a lighter side. And out of that came Dr. Miller for me, and my daughter here, Shawnette, who also works for public service, correct? And my daughter here that's a school teacher. So I just wanted to say there was something in that river.
Thanks, Mom. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Are there any other questions? Or a question? Oh, sorry.
I do want to say I am so happy and as well as blessed to see Dr. Miller, who went to school with my daughter at Cathedral School, and then look at her now. I hope my daughter Melanie Mann is watching you tonight, because I did send her a text message. You should be watching her at 6 o'clock at the Old State House streamlining you. I'm quite sure she is. But I do want to say I am a product of Charter Oak Terrace myself. And all that what she had spoken to us about, Miss Barbara Henderson. She was quite of an advocate, and she is a village mom that I respect to this day. Even with her daughter, Barbara Jr., who we went to school with, I am still in touch with her, and I'm always asking her, how are you doing? And that's how we build community throughout the years, by staying in touch. We do have every year a community gathering where we have all residents, former residents of not just Charter Oak Terrace, but Rice Heights come together, and we share memories. We talk about our grandchildren, we talk about our great-grandchildren, and we just have a great time just chit-chatting and talking about what's going on and what the great memories we've had as well. And I do want to say, there's a connection as to how Charter Oak Terrace is no longer there. They call it Charter Oak Market. But I don't know if you remember this, but I was a teacher in the school system, and I retired 8 years ago, of course. But my first job was a music teacher at Parkville School. And this young lady, her name is Marcelina Delgado, who was a first grader, in which she was one of my students. In 1994, she was sitting in the back seat of her parents' vehicle, delivering groceries to her grandparents in Charter Oak Terrace. The vehicle was mistakenly shot at by gang members, and at that time, of course, she was struck, and she had earned her wings. And that was the beginning of Charter Oak Terrace being leveled, because at that time, the advocacy at that time was to, let's get rid of this place, so killing fields in which we were losing members. But I still think of the positive memories of the place, of how we all grew up. But unfortunately, her memory still lives. And I remember that little smiling girl as she left my room. And then, of course, I will always remember her for that. But Charter Oak Terrace is one of great places that I will always cherish and remember. Thank you so much.
Anyone else?
There is no more charter house? There is no more?
Does it still exist, Charter Oak?
No, it doesn't exist anymore. It was demolished beginning in the late 1990s. And I don't know if you're familiar with the Charter Oak Marketplace that was just described, where there's Walmart, mainly Walmart, but other little stores as well. That is a part of where Charter Oak once was. And some land hasn't even been built on yet. And then there's some housing developments behind Prince Tech. That was also once Charter Oak Terrace as well. But in the built environment, what I find so interesting is you still see the different mainstays of Charter Oak, whether it's Barbara Henderson Bridge on Flatbush Avenue, and even Warburton Church on Flatbush and Brookfield. So the built environment has these remnants, but it's no longer here. Yeah.
Yeah. Hi. Before I get to my question, you're flashing a memory in my mind, because if you take the Interstate 84 exit, Flatbush, at the end, Charter Oak Marketplace is very noticeably on high ground. And that ground was filled in when they built the marketplace. It did not look like that with Charter Oak Terrace, because you made allusions to the fact that the entire Charter Oak Terrace would be flooded all the time. And it is interesting that once the corporate interests got involved, rather than housing for people, that all of a sudden it's now 15 feet above the ground.
Wow,
First, I was
yeah.
going to start off with a joke, which is I was hoping to see a photo of Shorty Superette, which was located right next to the bridge. You had made a quick allusion to, do you remember, you're probably too young to remember Shorty's.
I
Okay, well,
remember.
some people do. It was actually the only shop in the area.
Yes.
In fact, before this bridge was improved, as you mentioned it, it was
Yeah.
kind of an isolated area. People were kind of stuck. You don't have the CT fast track that you have today, for example, and everything. And Shorty Superette was the only place where you could go to buy milk and juice and bread and stuff like that. It wasn't a very large shop. It was smaller than this room probably, but it did serve a need.
Yeah, absolutely.
I was wondering if you could comment on why that Interstate 84 exit ramp is where it is. Because it's because you mentioned it briefly in your speech, but you
Yeah.
didn't mention much about it. Because it is unusual to get off an exit ramp, and in the 70s, the only thing there is a housing project. And I always remembered asking myself the question, why did they build
Why
it?
did-
I can't
yeah.
believe the government would build a housing ramp for a housing project. But it turns out there was another reason. If you could comment on that.
Yeah. That is a good question, because in developing this project, I also looked at some research done by those who work on environmental justice, or rather environmental injustice, and they found that, when cities and states are determining where they want to build certain structures or infrastructures, oftentimes areas not considered desirable or valuable are often targets where highways are built over or through areas where folks tend to be low income or at the intersections of all these forms of oppression that I've previously described. That does seem to be a correlation throughout time. And a lot of the mothers of ACP did speculate that being a cause of why the ramp was there. But the construction of the ramp posed such great issues for the community, especially the tools that they were using, or the dams, and more only made their efforts to respond to the rising waters even more difficult. But it definitely is a sign of environmental injustice, or using the land in a way that disadvantages people. Yeah. Oh.
Sorry, I'm not trying to take over. There is another reason why that ramp was built. It's in the Hartford Current, but you would really have to dig.
Okay.
Because if you go down to the very end of the ramp,
Yeah.
back in the old days, Charter Oak Terrace was in front, but if you made a right turn, there was a business there called Sussman and Blumenthal, which was a junkyard.
Yeah.
And
Yes.
what people forget is the Hartford City Council planned the route at council meetings, and Dick Sussman of Sussman and Blumenthal was on the city council, and he gave himself an exit ramp so his
Okay.
trucks could go on and
So
off.
there's that.
Getting to the theme of corporate interests, because
Yeah,
otherwise
corporate
they actually would
interests.
not have built that ramp, except
Thank
for
you
Sussman.
Wow. Yes. Yep.
Was a semi-professional football team at that time.
See,
I just wanna mention-
business economics. Wow.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And the other reason why Charter Oak isn't there, because of the activism, he's no longer with us. The late John Wardlow was a patriot when it came to, he had an issue with housing projects. He said when you have housing projects, you have people pretty much on top of each other. And when they're on top of each other, as demographics change, things start to happen. So yes, the late John Wardlow, and then there was a teacher that was close to our community as well, Wayne Williams. Yes, he was. These were folks that were pretty instrumental. We don't have to mention the late Paul Ritter. We already know. You read the Hartford Current, you'll know how much he.
Reverend Ritter, yes. No. Yes.
Yeah. We maybe have time for one last question or comment. Okay.
Well, thank you, Dr. Miller. That was fabulous. Let's give a hand.
Thank you.
And thank you to everyone coming tonight. It was really great to hear the stories and to hear about this neighborhood. It was wonderful. I would like to call your attention to food over here, but also next to the food is a feedback form. Okay, and the form the survey will help us to continue this project, to continue having these lectures. It asks about things like what other subjects would you like to have in this series, what you thought of it, and so forth. And this is helpful also for our funders so that we can give feedback to them from you. So it's very valuable for us to have your comments. They're over here, and there's some pencils and pens to help you out. Next week, we have Dr. Christina Blyer from the Watkinson Library at Trinity College, who will be speaking on a very interesting topic about a project that the Watkinson has done that is leading the way in socially conscious and social justice for ways of creating archival work that is not taking the archives out of the community, but it's actually partnering with the community to preserve those things. It's a very valuable, very interesting topic, and Christina Blyer will be sharing that with us next week, which is our last in this fall's series, and so we hope you'll come out for that.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Yes, thank you.